It is my pleasure to introduce today's ADRC seminar series speaker, Dr. Deters. Dr. Deters received a bachelor's and master's degree in biology. She then went on to earn her PhD in medical neurosciences at the Indiana University School of Medicine, where her research focused on genetic and imaging markers of tauopathies. She then went on to complete two postdoc fellowships, first with Dr. Elizabeth Moremino at Stanford, where she examined the ethnic racial disparities in Alzheimer's biomarkers. And then she went on to work with Dr. Sarah Banks here at UCSD to understand racial biases in neuropsychological assessments. She's now an assistant professor at UCLA, where her lab focuses on ethnic and racial disparities in predictors of cognitive decline in ADRD, including some of the stuff she's going to cover today. So genetics, social environmental factors, neuroimaging, and neuropsych assessments, with a particular focus on the Black community. Dr. Deters has received various awards for her scientific contributions, including the AAIC Neuroscience Next One to Watch Award and the NIA Butler Williams Scholar. Lastly, really important to mention, she's strongly passionate about community engagement and in Jedi efforts in the academic setting. He makes an active effort to provide mentorship and a safe space for trainees from minoritized backgrounds. Her talk today is titled Genetic and Imaging Correlates of Aging in 80 and Older Black Adults. And thank you again, Dr. Deters, for joining us today, and take it away.
Thank you for the introduction, Katie. I really appreciate it. Hello, good to see those of you that I, knew previously. Aaron, good to see you. Happy to be here. When I present, the way it's over here now, so it's going to look like I'm looking away from the camera, but that's just the way my slides are set up. So I apologize that I'm not like giving eye contact to the camera. But yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much. So I'm in my third year as faculty now at UCLA. So I'm just going to mainly be doing a little bit of background, but then also kind of just covering the stuff that we're doing in my lab. So it's kind of a hodgepodge. My titles always end up being super long though, so I just picked two of them that I'm going to be covering. Okay. There we go. So I like to give little intros to who I am. I think one of the things I'm really passionate about in faculty, as far as, everything Kitty just mentioned, but it's also to kind of destigmatizing scientists as being these oddities out there of like, who is a scientist? I just try to be a little bit more personal now. So I've been doing these little intro slides about who I am, just very briefly. So I'm born and raised in California, actually. So I've lived around the country. As you can see, this is my academic career I did my undergrad at UAB, my master's at Cal State. I did my PhD at IUPUI, and then I did my two postdocs at Stanford and UCSD, and now I'm at UCLA. So I've been around the country, and I can honestly say I'm truly a California girl. So I was really lucky that I was able to, that they had a job call that fit my work here at UCLA. I also come from a first generation single parent household. And so I have it kind of, we talk about the system not working for people that are in these positions, right? So, I mean, I still have, like $20,000 of college debt that, we're still have to pay off. And so luckily I did have the loan repayment program that's paying back my loans. So just to shout that out, if you don't have that, look into the loan repayment program because it's great. And so life's been challenging. And then how do I stay afloat now? I love to go to Disneyland. I have an annual pass, and I asked her for permission, but some of you may recognize Alejandra, who's at UCSD as well here. We go to Disney together and have a blast. So she's a scientist and was under Hector Gonzalez there at UCSD. I love reading. This is a really cool book, and it actually has to do with an Alzheimer's researcher who starts at Stanford, which is funny because that's what I was. And then it turns into a sci-fi mystery. So highly recommend this amazing book. And I love to travel. So, although we are scientists and we're here to, talk about critical things to proceed, we are still people. And I think that we need to remember that I'm actually glad that I don't see a lot of people on this call. I hope you are taking a break during the holidays, even though I'm here, but that's okay. I'm not traveling anywhere. So. Otherwise, next, I want to preface this by going into a little bit of terminology notes. And so Oftentimes you hear people, and including myself, right? It doesn't matter which group you belong to. Oftentimes there's a number of different ways that we hear people refer to their own identity. And so you might hear, for example, Latino, Hispanic, or Latinx, which is really more like the Latina now. And so with an E at the end. And so really, or Black African American and Black American, right? I want to put forth that you may hear me say it different terms, but usually I use the term that is referred to in that paper. And that's one of the things I do encourage other people to do that are looking into doing research into these different ethnic or racialized group. And that is to ask the group that you're studying what they want to be called. Yes, there may be something like if you're submitting an NIH grant and they have a specific way that you need to phrase something, or a paper may have a specific way. But I would also argue that you argue against them and just say, hey, I fully understand that this is in line, but FYI, our cohort prefers to be called Black or African American. And that's why we chose to use that in our grant. And so, we hope that we can respect that order. There's ways that I've been really working forward in my scholarship to promote equity in my research. And same thing, it's always just to remember that race is a social construct. It's not biological, even though we do talk about ancestry informative markers sometimes in our work, or specific genetic variation that may be more prominent. We still don't want to say that race is biological, because that definitely, contributes to, the racist rhetoric that can go really downhill in a lot of the things that we do. And so that is why sometimes you will hear me say, instead of race, right, we say racialized or minoritized, right? Because these are things that were placed on us, not things that we identify. This is the way that the society has identified us. They've racialized us as Black, or racialized us as fill in the blank, right? And same thing with sex and gender, just recognizing that gender and sex are different constructs. And so oftentimes you'll see a sex/gender because we did not ask those questions. And so it's important to clarify that we don't know if we're looking at sex or gender differences in our study, for example. And then finally, it's just, I think that there's so much confusion sometimes about disparities. People often think it's white versus blank, right? And they call it a disparity. But I think it's really important to remember that although there's no clear definition of health disparity, it all still surrounds the point that it's a health difference linked with social, economic, or environmental disadvantage, right? It is not racialized. Now, who are at disadvantage for these social, economic, and environmental disadvantage, they do link with racialized groups. And so I think it's really important that when we are proceeding with our studies and our research, that we just remember that the disparity is not linked to the racialized group. It's linked to these other factors that have disadvantaged these groups, and therefore people are using these racialized groups as a proxy. So this leads me to equitable research, if you cannot tell. It is a really big part of my life. I really strive. I think if I would want to be known as anything, it wouldn't be as a geneticist, it wouldn't be as an imager, it would just be as a health equity researcher, and really trying to promote the most appropriate ways, equitable ways to do research. And so I think a lot of people have seen this figure, this one here, right, where it talks about reality, equality, equity, and justice. And then you can tell it's not the same people, but like this person added an inclusion, because it is important to recognize that it's not just these factors. We need to work on an inclusive model, especially when it comes to research, and recognizing that it's more than just these items. These are all still extremely important, or equity and justice is still really important, but recognizing that trying to make our research as inclusive and as possible is really key to an equitable research practice. And so these are things, I like to share this slide now. This was a paper that was led by two, I think they were like a PhD student and an RA. Like, I think she just got into a PhD program. And she is currently working for NINDS now, I believe. So, but they published this when they were, in their previous years. And this is just talking about the racism that exists in neuroscience. And it's a great paper because this goes again to talking about inclusion. If you do not have minoritized or racialized groups that are included, that are in the room, people would not even recognize about some of the issues that exist, right? And this includes myself, again, for everything, right? It's not just having one group, it's about having all these different intersectionalities present in your research to recognize. And so one of these things that they mentioned that I think is just, more prevalent for the things we do is imaging, right? I mean, how many of us do MRI studies? Probably a number of us. And just recognizing that, for example, obviously we all know MRI is a giant magnet. You can't have metal in there. And there are different ethnic groups that have different hairstyles, for example, and like sew-ins or hair extensions could have metal in them. And therefore, they automatically would be excluded from your study because they cannot enter an MRI unless they change that, right? And so when you think about inclusive practices, even the tools we have to actually do our research is already racist in a sense, right? Because when we think about the people that are defining and creating these tools, they are led by typically white scientists, white researchers. So it's just thinking about these things. How can we then work on even the tools that we're using to make the tools more inclusive? Because as inclusive as we might want to be, right? We might want to have the people in the study, but then they can't because of something as simple as a hairstyle. And this also goes for anyone who's doing EEG, right? There are certain types of groups that have really coarse or curly hair, and it makes it really hard for electrode scalp connection. And the studies have shown that people with this type of hair, they have a lower signal from the EEG. And so this group, led by Black researchers, discovered that if you cornrow, or that's a slang way, I guess, of saying like, doing a twist or a French braid, back your hair, then you can expose the scalp a little more. And then they have these little things they call a servo clip they'd put in, then they would attach the electrode to the clip, and then it showed a much better signal from the EEG to scalp. So again, though, right, you're asking people to change something about themselves. So it's not just about inclusion and thinking about what a health disparity is, like the social aspects. It's also just really remembering that the tools that we have are not allowing us to be as inclusive as we would like. So when we continue on, we think about this. I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone this, but if we even think about, 2 of the FDA approved drugs, these studies were done in predominantly white individuals. You have aducanumab and lecanemab. I suck at saying the names. But as they have, been predominantly white. And this has been an issue as well because we know about ARIA, right? Amyloid-related imaging abnormalities that have been present from these anti-amyloid drugs. And although they're called imaging abnormalities, but they're literally like brain bleeds and things like that. So I wouldn't call that an abnormality, but these are vascular-related issues. And who is more at risk for vascular related health issues? That would be typically Black individuals in this country. And they were not typically included in the study. So when we think of this, and we see this, we recognize that, even currently when we're coming up with treatments, that's also not inclusive. And even we can even see this. This is data from the A4 study, the anti-amyloid asymptomatic Alzheimer's disease study. And we can see that although they did try to include a number of Black individuals were more likely to screen fail out of the study because they were having too low of cognitive scores was the predominant reason when it came to cognition for these. So this is yet another tool, right? Neuropsychological testing that we have that is showing a bias toward a specific group of people that are trying to be included in these, clinical trial studies. And oh my God, I was going to say something I forgot. Oh yeah, and then for this study with the neuropsychological test scores, I'm not going to get into a discussion about norming because that's a tough one. But for this study, they did decrease the neuropsychological test scores for minoritized groups. But even having the lower scale to get in, Black individuals were still being excluded. So I think this also just goes to show, again, I'm not getting into the full norming discussion, but even though we're trying to change or edit these tools to fix we're not there yet, right? We're just not there. There has to be something else that we're doing in order to make sure that our research is as inclusive as possible. So hopefully I don't have to convince you by now, but I'm still going to do the slide. And that would be, why is research within the Black community important? And so first of all, Black individuals are disproportionately more likely to have cognitive impairment. So we can see this is work from Elizabeth Rose Maeda. She's here at UCLA. But this shows the incidence rate of dementia is highest in Black individuals. Um, uh, uh, and this is data from Kaiser Permanente in Northern California, but this has also been shown in other studies as well. Yet whiteness continues to be centralized in research. And so, for example, this is the Ancestry catalog that's used for genetic or GWAS data. And you can see that it's largely European versus people who identify as Black. It's only 2%, and even less for people who identify as Hispanic or Latin American, it's only 1%. So when we're thinking about, even, again, yet another tool that we're trying to use for our research, it's still not at the same level, right, as we have for people of European descent. This is also really important because the United States is becoming more diverse. So for the first time, a few years ago, for the first time, we're actually seeing a decline in the United States as people who identify as white. And this is data from the US Census. While all the other groups are increasing, including people of two or more races. And so this also goes to something else I'm not going to talk about today, but just why looking at admixture is so important in our data, because people, especially the United States, are highly admixed. And so there's basically, again, this need just to bring justice and equity and inclusive practices to Black communities. So this leads me to my lab. And so again, I'm only in my third year. So the first 2 years was pretty chaotic. Not gonna lie, I'm sure if you're a faculty, you've experienced the joys of just figuring out how to run a lab. Like all of a sudden I went from being a neuroscientist to being an accountant for all of my grants and a therapist for students, and then I started teaching, and so it's been a whirlwind, but I finally feel like I'm actually getting settled now. And so this is my lab, and so basically we do look at life course genetic factors and equity and how that impacts brain aging, and we're measuring brain aging via a number of different mechanisms right now, but predominantly vascular burden, different pathological features, particularly amyloid, and neurodegeneration from MRI. And then how does that impact cognition or Alzheimer's disease and related disorders? And then, of course, as you've already heard me talk, maybe I haven't fully talked about this yet, but community engagement is super, super important to this. And as a two-way street, right? Without people participating in these studies, we would not have the data we need to answer these questions. Now, getting to community engagement practices, this is a really big one, right? I think that there's always been it's been really hard for me in this field because obviously I work in Black communities, and there's obviously a dearth of data when it comes to human studies data in Black cohorts, right? And I've talked to a number of people, and you hear things like it's so hard, or they just don't want to participate, or blah blah blah, or it's history, and people bring up Tuskegee, but I mean, it's science, right? And so I think of this in the context of everything. I say this all the time, but it's like an MRI machine. The MRI machine was really hard. Nobody just woke up one day and had the design in their head to build an MRI machine, right? Like there's trials and work. And it's the same thing when it comes to these other, marginalized communities. You have to put in work to figure out the way to get the people to want to participate in the research. And that's just not them participating, but it's you also giving back, understanding the needs, and making sure it's a two-way street and that you're not just taking. That is the biggest thing that I hate to see, is when people are like, well, they just won't participate. Okay, but what are you doing for them? like why do they have to come in? You think just because we're paying that's enough? But it's not, right? And then there's of course the bias about bribing with money, right? So it's a real challenge to figure out, and every community is going to be different. And so I think it's really important to not just think about how you can get them into a relationship with you, a bidirectional relationship, but also just focusing on the mechanisms of exclusion And this is a great paper from Dr. Andrea Gilmore-Bukowski, who's at Wisconsin, and Dr. Jennifer Manley is on this paper, and a lot of people that I truly admire their work. But it's not, again, it's not just how did I get these people in, it's making sure that you understand why somebody might be excluded. And I love this because it just talks about a number of different things, including ability-based discrimination, for example, transportation and language barriers. I think a lot of people have become more keen to how important transportation is. And I've seen a lot of people, for example, adding in Lyft or Uber or whatever, right? Or sending a car to pick them up, or even going to their house, right? And just really trying to lower the burden on people. And that also includes your team. Cultural competency is such a big deal. People are trying to use the same tools that may work for white individuals, which are the ones who we know are typically in our studies. But that, if you have and I'm speaking for myself, right? As I'm Black and white, but as a Black individual, if I see a poster with white individuals for a study, I may think, oh, that's not for me, right? And so there's a level of cultural competency, again, having more people on your team that have different intersecting personalities are going to be really important for materials for outreach. And then, of course, systemic issues, which I won't go on a tirade on that, but there's also a lot of these issues that come for that. So community engagement, shocker, is one of the things that I'm really striving for in my lab. And so a lot of these initiatives are led by Shawnice Johnson, who's an RA in my lab. And so this is just an example of our table. We created a poster. This is, 8th grade reading level, and this is just describing the research we have in our lab. And so just kind of a way to engage as well with people. And we're still working on swag. I think another thing I've learned being faculty, it is like really hard to order stuff. So ignore the rest of our table not having pretty swag, but we're actually ordering some stuff now, so finally. But and then this is the way that we've been doing it, and so I wanted to share it, which we'll be working on a paper shortly too. So first we identified community partners. Then we are also participating, and doesn't necessarily go in order, like some of these things are happening, tangentially, but there's also participating community events. So we table a number of events, and then there's also, things are on Zoom a lot now, and so it does make it easier actually to attend different organization. And then, you're there, you're present, they trust you, and I've been invited to talk at a number of these things now and have a number of people reaching out to me. And then, of course, funding. I mean, funding is really hard to get because unfortunately there's very few grants that actually come, but this is where it also goes to that systemic issue about, universities and different things. Like, we have to be able to put our money where we say we want to put our money. And I will say I've been very fortunate that, so I as new faculty, I asked for startup funds specifically for this. And then I also just, as of last Friday, got a grant, an internal grant that, is providing money purely for community engagement purposes. So I'm very excited that I have, some financial backgrounds securely for that, and that has nothing to do with, collecting data. Of course, providing to the community, this can be a number of different ways: education, providing food, right? Transportation. There's a number of different ways. And again, I'm a year into this, I'm still learning. So I'm just trying to share information that I've been using. And I know that a year from now, 2 years, 5, I'm going to have probably a whole different layout, but I'm still growing. And so I'm just trying to provide the information of what I've learned. And then, so this is pretty much where we've gone to. And then from here out, what our funding does allow for is focus groups. We're going to try to reach out to some members and hold some focus groups, just figuring out needs of our community, which we then hope to form a community board, community, and then we a grant with that CAB, right? I think that's a big thing we talk about is we shouldn't be telling the community what they need. We should be working with the community if we want them to be involved in our science in making sure that, again, there's this bi-directional relationship. And then I put retention and engagement everywhere out there because you should always be working on retention engagement. I do not have a lot for retention yet because, again, I've only been here for a short time. So the retention piece I don't think I've had to actively work at that yet, but I would say for me in the past year, the biggest thing that has been just showing up repeatedly to these meetings and building that rapport and talking to them and talking to people. But as far as, building a cohort and everything, I haven't done that yet, although that is my future goal. And so we'll see what happens with that. And I'm sure I'll learn lessons that I will publish in a paper. Okay. That was me. I've been starting with equity because it's just so important for science and research. So I'm going to start getting to the science now. And so first I'm going to talk about a study that we're doing. And this is about family history, amyloid, and ApoE. And this is led by my PhD student, Phelan Glenn, and then undergrad, Abena Mensabonsu. And then again, this project is funded. Oh, no, I didn't talk about this, but this project's funded from the California Department of Public Health. We got a grant, and then a Bunch Fellowship, which is the African American Center here. So again, I'm going back to the A4 study that I mentioned, the anti-amyloid asymptomatic Alzheimer's study. And I do have one publication from them as well. But this was one of the big seminal papers from the A4 study that was led. And this is led by Dr. Risa Sperling at MGH Harvard. And so in this, they found that family history of dementia was different between amyloid negative and amyloid positive. One positive thing about this study is that although it's still, not where we would like it to be, they do have a large number of different racialized groups other than white, especially Black and African American and Asian individuals. So again, being an equity lab, I wanted to use the data available until I'm able to build my own cohort. I have to use what I have. Those two students actually came to me with an interest in family history, so I wanted to support that. And although we know that having a family history of AD can serve as this potential risk factor, and it's associated with increased amyloid burden, as I just showed from that previous graph, when we went into the research, there is not a lot about family history in minoritized groups. And I mean, like, nothing really. So this is, again, I think a real big area that yet we have these defined, well-established risk factors that are really identified in one population that we're trying to put to all these other minoritized groups, and it may not hold true. So a big part of what I'm doing in my lab is we're just starting at the baseline. What are the risk factors for Black individuals? What do we know about, and does this hold true the same in Black communities? So first, because we have the data, we wanted to look at how positive family history in Black individuals may differ between these different groups. And then we wanted to look at the association between amyloid and family history, and, I forgot to add in there, whoops, and ApoE between these groups. So again, this is data from the A4 study. You can see how many Black, white, Hispanic, Asian American, and Japanese, because the A4 study also was in Japan. And so while they do group these into one Asian group, again, this talks about equity. If we know that there are cultural factors that are impacting health, it was important to us to separate this into Asian American or Japanese. And even this does not separate into South Asian versus East Asian individuals. So even this will have to have with a grain of salt, right? Besides the number of subjects that are different, overall, they're all pretty much around the same age. But one thing we did notice was just major sex differences. And so that's something to be wary about. So there's a lot more Black females than there were other groups. And then here, there's a lot in Japanese, for example, there's a lot more men. So these are just things to consider. Although we're not focusing on sex gender right now, it's just really important to notice also culturally who participates in research and who then do we need to target. So for example, one thing that I'm always going to tie this into engagement, by the way. But for example, this is also very reticent of all Black cohorts in the United States. They are typically female. And so targeting Black males and being able to, how can we engage them is also a very critical factor. And then you can see just kind of varying rates of family history here. So in general, just looking at rates of family history and dementia, we can see that we see some racialized differences here of Black, white, Asian American, white, and then Japanese versus everyone, which kind of makes sense because we do have the statistic that Asian individuals, if you remember back from that slide where I showed with Elizabeth Rosmaeda looking at dementia rates, Asian individuals do have this lower risk. And so it's interesting, though, that we see this in Japanese, not necessarily Asian American individuals, again, to show potential these cultural differences. And so again, this is not to pit Black versus white versus whatever, right? This is again to show that we have something that we know about in white individuals that is not holding true in other racialized groups. So we need to figure out then, where is this risk? And this is in prep. We're writing a article, so don't scoop us and publish this first. Okay, so next, and this looks like a lot, but I will walk through part of it, or most of it, but looking at the association of amyloid and ApoE with family history. So first, here's white individuals. We can see that having a positive family history of dementia was associated with having higher levels of amyloid. However, when ApoE was introduced into the model, that's model 2, we do see that we lost the association of family history and amyloid, suggesting here, right, that really where ApoE is such the strong factor, which we do know, and it does have this high risk, but it seems, to moderate the family history association. We do not see risk of family history and amyloid in any of the other ethnic or racialized groups, but we do know that the N is smaller, and I do want to point out that we see a very similar beta between a lot of these groups, everyone except for Asian American. And so we are wondering if we're only seeing significance here because of a power issue. And so that maybe these would be significant. And just for time's sake, we did do a matched where we do see some different results. I just don't have the time to go through that right now, but that is the next step, that we're just trying to make sure that we fully understand, the relation of power to these results as well. And then for Black individuals, white individuals, Hispanic individuals, and Japanese, again, everyone except for Asian American, we do see that, as expected, shocker, ApoE4 is associated with amyloid. So I think we're just trying to really understand this beta estimate in these other ethnic and racialized groups right now, and really trying to parse out whether it is a power issue or whether there is no significance between these. So that's just a short, small project that, my students did during the rotations here. And the next project I'll talk about is ApoE TOM40 and white matter microstructure. And this was led by the PhD candidate now in my lab, as she passed quals this summer, Caitlin Mooney. So just a little precursor to what TOM40 is. So there's this intronic allele here in TOM40 that's associated with increased cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease risk that may influence transcription of ApoE. And so if you look between white and Black individuals, again, it's a poly-T repeat, right? So there's like T at these at the allele. So here's the length of the number of T's, and you can see that they doesn't really seem different. But when we look at it at ApoE background, because this is just upstream, TOM40 is just upstream of ApoE, we start to see that there actually is a haplotype association between ApoE and TOM40, such that if you're E4 and white, you only have TOM40 repeats between like 19 and 30 or 20 and 30. But if you're Black and E4, you have a lot more variation in the TOM40 lengths. And TOM40 has been really underexplored because, again, most of science was white, or is white, I should say, not was. And so when they saw this TOM40 allele or variation of what they call long, L is for long, they actually thought they were only capturing ApoE. So TOM40 pretty much got pushed to the wayside. It wasn't until somebody went and looked at TOM40 in other groups to notice that there was variation in this TOM40 ApoE haplotype. And so previous studies have shown that this variation was associated with Alzheimer's risk in Black individuals. And then I have a previous publication from this. And I should mention, I'm so sorry, but this is data using a minority aging research study from Rush University and ROS-MAP, which I think more people are more familiar with. So Religious Order Study and Memory Aging Project, or the Rush Memory Aging Project. And so Black and white individuals. So here's short, long, and very long of people with the E4 background. And we saw that if you are Black and E4 and you carried the short variation, you had a significantly slower or better rate of cognitive decline relative to Black E4 carriers who did not have the short allele. And this is important. I'm just going to put all you important because not only was this significantly different than Black E4 carriers, Ignore that, I'm supposed to cover that. But these Black E4 carriers who had the short also were significantly slower rate of decline compared to the white E4 individuals. And so that's really important again, because we are possibly seeing something that is contributing to this differential E4 risk in Black individuals. And so it may not just be E4 is the most important allele. I do think it confers risk in all groups. It just, there are other potential genetic variations that we're not accounting for in our models. And this is also, you may notice when people show, when you may see papers about Black E4, sometimes it has risk, sometimes it doesn't. And it's so muddled between all these different groups. Well, this may be why. Not purely because of TOM40, but just because there are these other genetic risk variations that are maybe present in these groups. And then just to kind of introduce diffusion MRI, looking at white matter microstructure, we did this in collaboration with Derek Archer at Vanderbilt University. And so this is looking at white matter microstructural decline we know that's observed in normal aging and in Alzheimer's. His previous study did identify and look at the most prominent changes in limbic tracts. And so they measured white matter microstructure via two mechanisms, free water and free water corrected fractional anisotropy. And I just want to point out, because I'm going to show both, that they have opposite. So here, high values are abnormal for free water, and here, low values are abnormal for the corrected. I always forget, so I may flip back. I could literally never remember this, but just an FYI. And so anyway, again, the point of the slide is that this previous study did show that typically limbic tracts were more impacted by abnormal aging. And so we did just focus on the limbic tracts were identified. So looking at TOM40, we did find that having the short allele, or one copy of the short, was more associated with white matter in the cingulum bundle, and the, okay, there's more than that, sorry, but in the fasciculus, I can't read that, sorry, I realized a little fuzzy, the fornix and the inferior longitudinal fasciculus, IFL. So here's no S, 1S, and SS. And so here again, lower is abnormal, and here higher is abnormal. Okay, I didn't remember that. That's great. And you can see too that we're seeing different results, right? So what is the difference between free water and FA? Which I looked at the time and I realized I'm a little getting shorter on time, but it's important to note that, you know, this is another thing that we're trying to focus on the methodologies here and trying to understand what is, again, the best tool to actually look at this diffusion MRI. And so this is actually under review right now. We're super excited, our first paper from the lab. And so, and why are we, another thing is too, why are we only seeing 1S instead of 2S, considering my previous paper, for example, showed that having any S was associated with a decline. And so we think that part of the reason might be because there's a way lower number of subjects in this group that have free water, and I meant to add the number of subjects, and that's my fault, I forgot, but it's quite lower. They're like around the 30s, 40s, 50s for these groups. And so we think that because of not only a lower number, but the E4 group is E3E4 and E4E4. So if the short, for example, variant is attached to the E3, that may not confer the same protection or risk as the short variant attached with the E4. And we don't have that information to untangle, unfortunately, which we're hoping we can try to figure out in the future, but we could not get in time, so we are publishing without that. But we do think that maybe kind of conflating some of the risks that we're seeing there. And then the last project I want to talk about is my KO1. And so this is looking at social factors, brain integrity, and cognition. And so in general, before my KO1, we again know that ApoE4 is identified with cognitive decline. As I just showed you, TOM40 may impact this association in Black individuals. And on top of this, something I did not show, but it was also in a previous paper, we also found that Black individuals who carry E4 had lower levels of amyloid. And again, this is not to do a black-white comparison, but to show, to further prove, to other scientists that we have these quote unquote well-established risk factors that are not behaving the same in Black individuals. And unfortunately, as much as, you know, a number of us believe this, we have to convince other the scientific community, which is, again, the only reason why we do this, right? It's not for just a black-white comparison. And so we see, yeah, lower amyloid in E4 carriers. And not only that, but we also found in people of African ancestry have lower, or aka better, levels of amyloid. Again, showing that, okay, maybe amyloid is probably still bad, but maybe it's just not conferring the same association or same risk, or we shouldn't be attributing the same risk for Black individuals in this group. So this is where I'm at, like where I was at with my science. And not only that, but when we look at those amyloid vascular, which I just showed the white matter hyperintensities, looking at vascular or microstructure and neurodegeneration, this is a study from Patrick Lau at Columbia University. I believe this data is using YCAP, which I forgot what YCAP stands for, but it's a study out of a cohort out of New York. And basically, unfortunately, we do not have tau in a lot of marginalized groups, which I think most people are aware of. So this does not include tau. But we do see that for pretty much white individuals, the AVN does basically remove almost all of the neurodegeneration, or I'm sorry, the cognitive decline that we see, suggesting how important AVN is for these groups. But when we're looking at Black and Hispanic, we can still see this pretty sharp decline, right? In these groups here, in this group, again, suggesting that AVN may not be as crucial as we think it is for cognitive decline in these other racialized groups. So what is another factor, something I've been alluding to, and that is social factors, right? Again, going back to that definition of health disparity, that the social, economic, environmental factors, we have to focus on non-biological, these ones over here, and how that can impact overall health. And this is a great study. So this is something I never thought about until I was asked to teach a lecture on neurobiology of racism. And this is something that's really important and something I really started to dig into. And this is a paper that shows basically the racialized difference in brain activity to threat. And so you can see that here is this raw, you know, you have this association of threat, you know, from this fMRI study. But then when you look at negative life experiences or disadvantage, you can see that it's almost all the way gone. Again, suggesting just how important looking at social factors is to our studies and how it can impact the brain. This is also important because obviously I live in Los Angeles here, and so here's where are we? Okay, here's Culver City, Beverly Hills. We're right out. This is UCLA. It's blocked out, and then this is the airport, LAX. So you can tell like where people don't live, they have those kind of blocked out. And so Santa Monica, and then you can see that blue is the least disadvantaged. This is where the richer live. And the darker colors is the more disadvantaged. And where do you see the most disadvantaged areas? That would be in places that are typically Hispanic and African American or Black. You have Compton, Linwood, Gardena, Inglewood, which is where I live. All these areas are more predominantly marginalized groups. So this is really critical when we think about how overall, you know, social neighborhood disadvantaged social factors are impacting brain health. This is also further shown by a study from Dr. Laura Zahodny. This is really interesting. This was looking at discrimination as associated with hippocampal volume and white matter hyperintensities. Again, the V and the N out of the ATVN, and we see that having more discrimination is associated with lower hippocampal volume and higher white matter hyperintensities. And you can think, you know, how is this impacting it? And I just want everyone to think about what experiencing a lifetime of racism or discrimination might impact, right? You have physiological reactions to that, right? You can have hormonal disruptions, all these different stress that leads to that can compound over a lifetime to these biological changes. So if you're just looking at hippocampal volume in Black individuals and white and you see it's lower, it may not be because they're more skewed toward MCI or Alzheimer's. It can be because there are other factors that have occurred over the life course that have really impacted, that have affected or their biological background. So this leads to my K01, and I have an RA, Christian Mojica, who's been helping me get this together. I was hoping to have this done, but there were some certain things that happened in November that I had to cancel some meetings. So we are looking at how does imaging factors mediate the association of social factors on cognitive decline. And so that's where we're starting. I do plan to have this done by AAIC and submit this as an abstract. So I hope to have that to present in a paper out by then. But we're looking at early life, midlife income, and then late life social factors and figuring out the best ways to model this. And so with that, I'm going to finish, so there's time for discussion if you're into it. But I really thank the women of color that I have in science. It's really hard to be here, and honest to God, like without these wonderful people on the slide, I wouldn't be where I am. These are people who have supported me in grants, added me on papers, and collaborated with me, and just been a listening ear when I need it, and a support system. And then with that, I'd like to thank everyone. Still growing my team here, so I don't have like a super lot of collaborations or anything, but I have a wonderful, great lab. And then of course, I think all my, my previous experience with my postdoc team, and then just key collaborators. And then the funding, we're finally starting to get a lot of funding. This is my lab minus one person. After we just did the walk to end Alzheimer's a few weeks ago, and then we were at AIC. I brought my first 3 students, and it was really exciting. So yeah.